Hey everyone. Tonight we're going to drift back into the deep, unrelenting nights of the Middle Ages. Not the candlelit halls of kings, not the guarded walls of castles, but the humble huts of peasants, where the struggle against darkness was as constant as the struggle for bread. These nights were long, cold, and heavy, pressing down on people who had little more than a weak fire, a woolen blanket, and each other to hold back the weight of the dark. Imagine the sun dipping beyond the fields, its last rays fading while peasants rush to finish their work before shadows consume the village. Doors are barred, animals are brought inside, and branches are piled beside the hearth. The smell of smoke fills the single room, clinging to the rafters, while children cough in the thick air. A thin stew simmers in a blackened pot, eaten quickly while the flames still burn, for once the fire dies down, the cold takes its place. And yet somehow peasants endured. They huddled, whispered, prayed, and clung to the slow passing of hours until at last the cock crowed, signalling that dawn was near. Another night survived, another day of toil waiting, and the endless cycle beginning again. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always comforting to know how far this little community stretches, even across such different nights. Part 1, The Coming of Night, the last glow of day. The day had been long, stretching from the first bruised light of dawn until this moment, when the sun dipped, a tired eye behind the distant line of fields. It was not a gentle descent, but a swift, almost reluctant plunge into the deepening shadows. The air, which had held a tenuous warmth throughout the day's endless toil, now sharpened, carrying the distinct, biting chill that heralded the coming of a long, brutal night. For the medieval peasant, the last glow of day was not a signal for rest, but for a frantic, almost desperate scramble to finish what remained to gather the last necessities to prepare the fragile shields against the encroaching darkness. The last glow of day. In the fields where the day's work had chained you since before light, the pace quickened. Hands, already aching and raw from gripping the plough or the hoe, moved with renewed urgency. The last row of turnips needed to be pulled before the earth hardened with frost. The final armful of straw had to be gathered for the animals' bedding. Every minute of diminishing light was precious, every task left undone a vulnerability in the long hours ahead. The distant silhouettes of other villagers, hunched figures against the fading light, mirrored your own frantic efforts, a silent, communal understanding of the night's demands. The sky, once a vast expanse of pale blue, now bled into hues of fiery orange, deep purple, and somber grey, painting a dramatic, transient backdrop to the humble struggle unfolding below. The trees, their branches stark and skeletal against the deepening twilight, seemed to lean in, their shadows lengthening, merging with the growing gloom that crept out from the forest's edge. The air filled with the earthy scent of turned soil, mingling with the subtle, distant tang of wood smoke already rising from the village hearths. As the sun's last fiery kiss vanished from the horizon, a profound quietude began to settle. The chirping of birds, once abundant, subsided into a few last, hesitant calls. The lowing of distant cattle grew muted. Even the wind, which had rustled through the tall grasses, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the full embrace of night. This quiet, however, was not peaceful. It was a watchful stillness, pregnant with unspoken fears. You unhitched the scrawny ox from the plough, its breath pluming white in the chill air, its ribs showing starkly beneath its shaggy hide. Its weariness mirrored your own. Together you walked the familiar rutted path back towards the village, the rough tracks of the plough, a dark, fresh scar against the rapidly fading landscape. The path was uneven, treacherous in the dim light, requiring careful steps to avoid twisting an ankle, an injury that in this unforgiving world could spell disaster for a family. The village, a cluster of low-slung, mud-daubed huts, nestled together for warmth and mutual protection, appeared as a scattering of faint, flickering lights against the deepening grey. Each tiny glow was a beacon, a fragile declaration of human presence against the overwhelming darkness. The smell of wood smoke, thick and pungent, grew stronger, pulling you towards the promise of the hearth. But even as you approached your own dwelling, the rush was not over. There were children to gather, their small forms already shivering in the chill, animals to secure, their vulnerable warmth needing protection. Any loose tools, any stray piece of valuable timber had to be brought inside lest they be claimed by the darkness, by opportunistic neighbors, or by the wild animals that grew bolder with the night. The small, low doorway of your hut, typically open to the daylight, now stood as a gaping maw inviting the cold. Inside, a weak flame might already be struggling to catch, casting dancing, uncertain shadows. Your wife, perhaps already stoking the embers, her face illuminated by the fitful glow, her movements as hurried as your own. The collective efforts of the village were a slow, deliberate drawing inward. Each family unit, a small island of warmth and light, pulled its resources together, creating a bulwark against the vast, cold ocean of the night. The sounds of doors being hastily barred, of livestock being shooed into their byres, of muffled voices calling out last-minute instructions. These were the sounds of a community hunkering down, preparing for the long hours ahead. You carried the last armful of kindling, each dry branch a testament to the day's persistent foraging. Its weight pressed down on your already aching shoulder, but it was a welcome burden, for it represented heat, light, and a fragile shield against the pervasive cold. As you stepped across your own threshold, leaving the last glow of day to vanish entirely behind you, a profound sense of relief mingled with the familiar dread of the coming night. The sun had dipped, the world outside was claimed by darkness, and the long, silent vigil had truly begun. Gathering firewood. The fire was not a luxury, it was the fragile heartbeat of the peasant's hut, the very essence of life during the long, brutal nights of the Middle Ages. Its warmth, its light, its power to cook food and deter unseen threats were paramount. Therefore, the gathering of firewood was a daily, relentless task, a silent liturgy of survival. Each branch stacked by the door was a defense against the cold, against the encroaching fear that the darkness brought. The forest, or what remained of it near your village, was not a place of bucolic beauty. It was a dense, often menacing tangle of trees, undergrowth, and fallen branches. Its depths held secrets, dangers, and the constant promise of fuel, if you were willing to work for it. The best timber, the larger, straighter pieces, would have long since been claimed by the Lord S. foresters, or by those with the means to cut and haul. What remained for the peasant were the scraps, the fallen, the decaying. Your journey into the woods usually began in the morning, or immediately after the main field work, as soon as the sun offered enough light to see. You carried a crude axe, its head blunt from endless use, or a heavy flat stone, its edges sharpened by rubbing against another rock. Your hands were rough, calloused, and stained with the earth and the sap of countless trees. The act of gathering was less about cutting down and more about finding. Your eyes scanned the ground, trained by years of necessity to spot a fallen branch amidst the leaf litter, a gnarled piece of root half buried in the soil, a dry, dead sapling that might yield a few precious sticks. Every piece, no matter how small, was valuable. A child accompanying you would be equally diligent, their small hands eager to find twigs and pine cones. The air in the forest was damp, cool, and carried the pungent scent of decaying leaves, wet earth, and the faint, sweet smell of moss. Overhead, the canopy of branches, often bare and skeletal in the colder months, allowed only a dappled, hesitant light to filter through, creating a perpetual twilight, even at midday. The sounds of the forest were hushed, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the distant caw of a crow, the occasional scamper of a small, unseen creature. But beneath these there was a deeper, watchful silence, a sense of being observed. The work was slow, laborious. Each dry branch had to be snapped or, if too thick, hammered with the blunt axe until it broke. Larger pieces had to be dragged, scraping against the uneven ground, their weight immense. You would strip off any clinging bark, any damp moss, to ensure the wood was as dry as possible, for wet wood meant smoke, not heat, and a fire that struggled to catch. The bundle would grow, held together by a loop of rough rope or a piece of twisted vine. It was a physical testament to your efforts, a visible measure of your family's likely comfort, or discomfort, in the coming night. Your back would ache, your shoulders burn, and your hands would be raw, but you would push on, driven by the knowledge of the biting cold that awaited if your efforts fell short. As the sun began its inevitable dip towards the horizon, casting the forest into deeper, more ominous shadows, a sense of urgency would descend. The wild grew bolder with the dark. The distant cry of a wolf or the sudden snap of a branch in the undergrowth would send a shiver of unease down your spine, quickening your pace. You did not linger in the forest after dusk. Back at the hut, the precious bundle of firewood would be stacked carefully by the door, often inside, just beyond the threshold. The larger pieces for sustained warmth through the night. The smaller twigs and kindling for the delicate art of rekindling the embers in the morning. Each stick was not just fuel, it was a small victory against the encroaching cold, a tangible bulwark against the terror of a fireless night. The act of gathering firewood was more than a chore. It was a profound interaction with the environment, a constant negotiation with the scarcity of resources. It was a physical manifestation of the struggle for energy, for survival. Without this daily effort, without the meticulous collection of every usable scrap of wood, the hearth would remain cold, the hut dark, and the night a truly terrifying, unendurable ordeal. As you gazed at the pile of wood, its rough surfaces catching the faint, flickering light from inside, a sense of grim satisfaction would settle. It was enough for tonight. Each stick was a small shield, a quiet promise of warmth, and a small, flickering flame that defied the vast, indifferent darkness that now claimed the world outside. The wood was stacked, the door would soon be barred, and the long watch against the cold and fear could truly begin. Closing the animals in. The medieval peasant's hut was rarely a solitary dwelling, housing only humans. In a world where every scrap of warmth and every living creature represented precious capital, the animals were not just livestock. They were an integral part of the household, brought close, often under the very same roof. As darkness descended, the ritual of closing the animals in was a crucial act, intertwining the fates of man and beast in a shared struggle against the cold and the dangers of the night. The byre, often an extension of the main living space, or simply a partitioned corner of the single-room hut, would already be prepared. Fresh straw, if available, would have been laid down, offering a thin layer of insulation from the damp earth floor. The air, even before the animals were fully settled, carried the distinct pungent aroma of their presence, the sweet scent of hay, the earthy smell of dung, the rich, musky tang of their bodies. You would go out into the fading light calling to the few creatures that constituted your family's wealth. The scrawny cow, perhaps, a single, stoic presence whose milk was a lifeline, whose strength pulled the plough. A goat or two, their restless intelligence making them harder to herd, but their milk equally vital. And the chickens, a clucking, fluttering chaos, their eggs a precious source of protein. Herding them indoors was often a noisy affair, a symphony of bleats, lowing, and agitated clucking. The cow, with its ponderous bulk, would have to be coaxed through the low doorway, its wide, dark eyes blinking in the dim light of the hut. The goats, more agile, would dart and weave, sometimes needing a gentle shove to guide them towards their designated space. The chickens, a whirlwind of feathers, would be shooed into their coop, a rough-hewn box or basket, for their own protection. Once inside, the sounds of the animals settling would fill the small enclosed space. The rhythmic chewing of the cow on a small handful of hay, the soft snuffling of the goat, the contented clucking of the chickens as they found their roosts. Their breath, warm and heavy, would mingle with the smoke from the hearth, adding another layer to the thick, close air of the hut. The decision to bring animals indoors was not born of sentimentality, but of profound practicality. Firstly, protection. The night was a dangerous place. Wolves, bears, and other predators prowled the forests, their hunger sharpened by the scarcity of the long winter. A valuable cow left outside was an invitation to disaster, a potential loss that could doom a family. Even opportunistic thieves, driven by desperation, might brave the darkness for an unattended animal. Secondly, and perhaps more crucially in the depths of winter, was warmth. The animals' bodies, radiating their own vital heat, became a living furnace in the small, unheated dwelling. Their collective warmth, combined with the struggling fire, could raise the ambient temperature of the hut by a few precious degrees, making the difference between a tolerable cold and a truly dangerous, life-threatening freeze. You could feel it, even from your straw bed, a subtle biological heat that pushed back against the biting chill that seeped through the walls. The proximity of the animals, however, came with its own set of challenges. Their dung and urine would add to the pervasive dampness and smell of the hut, requiring constant attention to keep the byre as clean as possible. Flies, even in colder weather, would be an annoyance, and the constant rustle and movement of sleeping animals could be a source of distraction, another impediment to truly restful sleep. Yet these were small prices to pay for the invaluable benefits they offered. As the night deepened and the fire dwindled to a glow of embers, the animals would settle into a quieter rhythm. The cow's heavy breathing, the soft snuffling of the goat, the occasional quiet cluck from a chicken. These sounds became a comforting backdrop to the human occupant's sleep, a gentle chorus of life affirming its presence in the face of the overwhelming darkness and cold. You would lay on your straw bed, wrapped in your rough woolen blanket, and feel the subtle emanations of warmth from the byre. It was a primal, ancient connection, man and beast huddled together, sharing the fragile confines of a shelter against the indifferent forces of nature. The smell, the sounds, the shared warmth. These were the intimate realities of medieval peasant life, a testament to the symbiotic relationship forged in the crucible of survival. The moon, if it shone, might filter through a crack in the shutters, casting a pale, ghostly light that illuminated the shadowy forms of the sleeping animals. They were not merely creatures, they were a living barrier against the night, their warmth as valuable as their milk, their presence a quiet, steadfast reassurance, and in their soft, rhythmic breathing there was a profound sense of shared vulnerability and shared endurance against the long, brutal hours until dawn. The animals were in, the door was barred, and the byre became a living, breathing part of the peasant's fragile home, shuttering the windows. As the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, taking with it the illusion of safety and clarity, a crucial act of preparation for the night began, the shuttering of the windows. These were not the grand glass-paned apertures of a lord's manor, but crude functional openings, and their closure was less about keeping out the weather and more about blocking out the wind and whatever else moved in the vast untamed darkness beyond the hut's fragile walls. The windows of a peasant's hut were typically small, few, and rarely glazed. If there was a covering at all, it might be a thin piece of scraped animal bladder or horn, offering a dim, diffuse light, but little insulation. More often they were simply unglazed openings, or at best, covered with a heavy, smoke-stained hide that could be pulled across. As dusk deepened, these openings became vulnerabilities, cold eyes staring out into the growing gloom. You would move with a sense of quiet urgency, your hands already accustomed to the task. The wooden shutters were rough-hewn planks, often salvaged or crudely fashioned, their surfaces splintered and worn. They were not hinged, but rather slotted into place, or held by simple wooden pegs, requiring careful alignment and a degree of force to secure. The sound of wood scraping against wood, the muffled thud as a shutter found its resting place, was a small, decisive punctuation mark against the encroaching silence. Once the shutters were in place, secured with a wooden bar or a heavy stone wedged against them from inside, the hut plunged into an almost absolute darkness. Any faint, lingering light that had seeped in was now banished, leaving only the flickering glow of the hearth fire to illuminate the small, enclosed space. This sudden, deliberate sealing off from the outside world was both a comfort and a heightened sensory experience. The immediate effect was a tangible shift in the air within the hut. The biting wind, which had whistled through the openings, was now largely excluded, though its persistent murmurs would still be felt and heard as it probed the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the thatch. The temperature might rise by a fraction, the air feeling thicker, more contained, imbued with the combined warmth of human and animal bodies. But the shutting of the windows was as much about psychological defense as physical comfort. It was a barrier against the unseen. Outside, the night was not merely dark, it was alive with potential threats. The red eyes of a hungry wolf, the silent, stealthy approach of a bandit, the vague, unsettling presence of spirits or malevolent forces whose power was believed to wax strongest in the deepest gloom. By closing the windows, you drew a line, declaring your small space off limits to the dangers that lurked in the vast, unlit world. The darkness inside, broken only by the dancing shadows of the fire, felt deeper, more profound. Familiar objects became indistinct shapes, shifting and transforming in the fitful light. It was a darkness that encouraged listening, that sharpened the other senses. Every creak of the timber frame, every rustle of straw, every shift of a sleeping animal became amplified, drawing your attention to the inner life of the hut. The sound of the wind, now muffled, would seem to press against the outside of the shutters, a spectral hand testing the integrity of your defenses. You could almost feel its cold breath seeping through the smallest gaps, reminding you of its ceaseless presence. The quiet hum of the night, sometimes broken by the distant call of an owl or the sharp bark of a village dog, reinforced the sense of being contained, separated, protected within your fragile shell. For the children, the shuttered windows transformed the hut into a fortress. Huddled close to the hearth, their eyes wide, they absorbed the atmosphere of heightened vigilance. The stories whispered by the firelight of mythical beasts and cunning rogues took on a more vivid, chilling reality in the enclosed space. The simple act of blocking out the night was a powerful, unspoken narrative of protection. You would lay on your straw bed, wrapped in your rough blanket, feeling the shift in the air, listening to the muffled sounds. The wooden shutters, though crude, were your shield. They blocked out the piercing gaze of the stars, the unsettling vastness of the moonlit fields, the shifting forms of the shadows that clung to the edges of the village. They created a sense of enclosure, a small, contained universe where your family could find a precarious safety. The shuttering of the windows was an ancient, primal gesture of defense. It was a daily declaration that for a few precious hours the outside world, with all its dangers and its overwhelming indifference, would be kept at bay. The wooden boards blocked out the wind, and whatever else moved in the deep, untamed darkness, allowing for a fragile, temporary respite until the hopeful, if brief, return of the sun, the evening meal. With the sun now fully vanished, the animals settled into their byre, and the windows shuttered against the creeping night. The rhythm of the peasant's day shifted momentarily to a different kind of warmth, the communal ritual of the evening meal. This was not a feast, nor a moment of Epicurean delight. It was a simple, stark necessity, a vital act of replenishment performed quickly while the embers still burned bright, before the full, heavy grip of sleep and the deepest cold descended. The center of this ritual was the hearth. Its fire, now carefully tended to be a persistent glow rather than a roaring blaze, cast the only meaningful light in the hut. Its flickering orange and red hues danced across the rough-hewn faces of your family, turning familiar features into shifting masks of shadow and light. The thick, smoky air, already dense with the scent of damp earth and living animals, now acquired a new, comforting layer, the aroma of cooking. The meal itself was almost always the same: pottage. A thick, sustaining, if monotonous, stew cooked in a single, heavy cauldron suspended over the embers. It was a testament to the limited resources and the ingenuity of scarcity. Today it might be a thin broth made from dried peas, a few foraged roots like turnip or parsnip, perhaps a handful of wild greens, and if truly fortunate, a small, precious piece of cured pork fat slowly rendered to add a whisper of richness. The ingredients varied with the seasons, but the essential character remained constant: humble, hearty, and designed to fill, if not fully satisfy, hungry bellies. You would use a large wooden spoon, passed from hand to hand, to ladle the pottage into individual wooden bowls, or perhaps simply scooped onto thick slices of stale bread that served as edible plates. The bread itself was coarse and dark, made from whatever grain the last harvest had yielded, often barley or rye, bulked out with bran. It was hard, requiring firm teeth and jaw to tear, but it was filling, providing a crucial caloric base to the thin stew. There was little conversation during the meal. The act of eating was too fundamental, too urgent. Chewing was deliberate, slow, savoring each mouthful to extract its full, if limited, flavor. The children ate with a focused intensity, their small hands gripping their bowls, their eyes fixed on the food, knowing that seconds were a rare, precious gift. The silence was broken only by the sounds of chewing, the occasional slurp of hot pottage, and the steady, comforting crackle of the embers. The warmth of the pottage, even if thin, was a welcome internal embrace against the persistent chill of the hut. It flowed down, a soothing fire in the stomach, radiating outwards, momentarily pushing back the insidious cold that constantly threatened to reclaim your body. It was a brief moment of bodily comfort, a fleeting respite before the deeper cold of the night truly set in. You ate quickly, for the evening meal was often the last significant food until the following day's breakfast, or often until midday. Every morsel was vital. The bowls were scraped clean with a piece of bread, or with a finger, ensuring not a single calorie was wasted. Food was life, and waste was a luxury that could not be afforded. After the meal, the utensils would be wiped clean with a cloth or a handful of straw, then perhaps rinsed with a small amount of water from the bucket by the door, water that was too precious to use lavishly. The remnants, if any, would be carefully stored or given to the animals, for nothing was truly discarded. As the last of the food was consumed and the bowls put away, a subtle shift in the atmosphere would occur. The intense focus on eating would give way to a deeper settling in for the night. The fire, which had been bright for the cooking, would now be allowed to dwindle, banked with ash to preserve the embers. Its light would soften, casting longer, more profound shadows, hinting at the true darkness that would soon envelop the hut. The lingering scent of the pottage, warm and earthy, would slowly fade, replaced by the deeper, more pervasive aromas of smoke and damp earth. The satisfaction of the meal, though never truly filling, provided a temporary shield against the gnawing hunger that always lurked just beneath the surface. The evening meal was a quiet declaration of endurance, a testament to the persistent will to survive. Eaten quickly, almost solemnly by the flickering light of embers, it was a moment of communal sustenance, strengthening the bodies and the fragile spirits of the family for the long, cold, and often fearful hours that lay ahead. It was the last ritual of the day before surrendering to the profound stillness of a medieval night. Part 2. The struggle against cold, the hearth's weak flame. With the evening meal consumed and the last of the day's tasks finished, the true battle of the medieval night began, the relentless struggle against the cold. The hearth, the beating heart of the peasant's hut during daylight, now diminished, its fire reduced to a weak, flickering flame. It offered more comfort than heat, a psychological beacon against the dark, leaving shadows to fill the room, their shifting forms dancing a silent, eerie ballet on the rough, smoke-stained walls. The fire had been carefully banked after cooking, covered with a thick layer of ash to preserve the precious embers. Now, only a few small, stubborn flames licked tentatively at the last pieces of dry kindling, their light too feeble to truly push back the gloom. The bulk of the room remained shrouded in deep shadow, the flickering light only serving to highlight the impenetrable darkness that pressed in from all sides. The air in the hut was thick and heavy, a complex blend of old wood smoke, damp earth, the musky scent of animals, and the pervasive tang of human presence. It was a cold air, even with the fire, for the hut's crude construction offered little insulation. The mud-daubed walls, however thick, bled heat outwards, and the thatched roof, however meticulously laid, allowed cold draughts to seep downwards. You sat close to the hearth, if only for a brief while, before retreating to your straw bed. The warmth it offered was fleeting, a small halo that barely extended beyond the immediate circle of its glow. You could feel the radiant heat on your face, on your exposed hands, but your back would remain cold, a constant reminder of the pervasive chill. It was a warmth to be savoured, absorbed into the very bones, for it would not last. The shadows were the true inhabitants of the room. They stretched long and distorted from every object. The crude stool became a squatting beast. The hanging tools morphed into menacing figures. The sleeping forms of your family became indistinct mounds under their blankets. In the deepest parts of the hut, where the ember's glow could not reach, the darkness was absolute, thick and velvety, a tangible presence. The sounds were amplified in this subdued light, the soft, almost inaudible crackle of a dying ember, the gentle rush of the wind probing the cracks in the walls, the distant muffled sounds of the sleeping animals. Sometimes a piece of green wood, forgotten in the pile, would hiss and spit, sending a brief puff of acrid smoke into the air, momentarily invigorating the weak flames. For the children, nestled close, the weak flame was a comfort. It was a guardian against the terrifying monsters of their imagination, a source of gentle light that allowed for the last, reassuring glimpses of their parents' faces before sleep claimed them. For the adults, it was a symbol of enduring life, a quiet defiance against the overwhelming power of the night's cold. The smoke, a constant companion of the hearth, drifted lazily upwards, curling around the rafters, staining the thatch a permanent, dark brown. It sought the smoke hole in the roof, or seeped out through cracks in the walls, but much of it lingered, creating a perpetual haze that softened the edges of everything, adding to the atmospheric gloom. The struggle against cold was a continuous losing battle through the night. You banked the fire, yes, hoping to preserve a core of embers until morning, but the heat quickly dissipated. The air would grow steadily colder, the frost perhaps beginning to gather on the inside of the roof timbers, a glistening white testament to the encroaching chill. You would eventually retreat to your straw bed, pulling blankets tight, huddling close to your family. The warmth of the hearth would quickly become a memory, replaced by the persistent, insidious cold that would seek out every exposed patch of skin, every poorly insulated layer. But the image of that weak flame, its gentle flicker against the overwhelming darkness, would persist in your mind. The hearth's weak flame was more than just a source of a little heat. It was a focal point, a spiritual center, a silent declaration that even in the deepest, coldest night, humanity would not succumb entirely to the dark. It was a symbol of hope, a fragile, flickering light in a world consumed by shadow, reminding you that a fire never truly died, but slept, waiting for the dawn to be coaxed back to vibrant life. And in its dying glow, shadows would fill the room, but the faint, enduring promise of light would remain. Blankets of wool and straw. The cold of the medieval night was a relentless, pervasive enemy, a silent predator that sought to steal the warmth from every living body. Against this insidious foe, the peasant's primary defense was not thick walls or a roaring fire, but layers. Every scrap of cloth, every hide, every armful of straw, piled high, a fragile but essential shield against the biting frost. These were the makeshift fortifications of sleep, the desperate effort to retain the precious heat of the body. Your bed was not a soft mattress or a raised frame, but a shallow depression in the packed earth floor, often lined with woven rushes or rough-hewn boards. Upon this, a generous, if ever-dwindling layer of straw was spread. The straw, coarse and dry, was the first line of defense, offering a modicum of insulation from the bone-chilling damp that seeped up from the earth. It rustled faintly with every shift of your body, a dry, whispering sound that filled the quiet spaces of the hut. Above the straw, your blankets were a precious collection of whatever could be found and kept. The primary covering would be a thick, heavy blanket of raw, unbleached wool. It was scratchy against the skin, smelling faintly of sheep and wood smoke, its texture rough, but its warmth undeniable. This wool was often from your own few animals, laboriously shorn, carded, spun, and woven by weary hands. It was patched repeatedly, its surface a testament to countless repairs, each mend a story of enduring use. Layered over the wool would be other scraps, pieces of cured animal hide, perhaps from a deer or a wild boar, its leather stiff and cool to the touch, but offering an impervious barrier against drafts. Or, if you were fortunate, a smaller, thinner blanket woven from linen or nettle fibers, offering a smoother, if less warm, inner layer. Every piece, no matter how small or worn, was valued, its potential for warmth carefully considered. The act of settling into bed for the night was a ritual of huddling. You would burrow deep into the straw, pulling the layers of blankets up to your chin, tucking them around your shoulders, trying to create a small, insulated cocoon. The air trapped between the layers, warmed by your own body heat, became your most precious resource, a personal microclimate against the pervasive cold. The cold, however, was cunning. It found its way through gaps in the blankets, through thin spots in the straw, creeping in from the open spaces of the hut. You would wake in the dead of night, a shiver running down your spine, feeling the chill on an exposed arm, or the icy breath of a draft on your face. A restless turn, a tug at the blanket, a deeper burrow into the straw. These were the constant, subconscious movements of a body battling for warmth. The straw, while offering insulation, was also a constant source of discomfort. It poked and scratched, worked its way into your clothes, and harbored fleas and other biting vermin, whose relentless itching added another layer of irritation to the struggle for sleep. It would grow damp from condensation, from the persistent humidity of the earth, eventually needing to be replaced, a task of immense labor. Yet despite its discomforts, the straw was indispensable. It transformed the cold, hard earth into something remotely habitable, something that could hold a modicum of warmth. It was the fundamental base of the peasant's bed, an ancient, enduring technology of survival. The other members of your family, pressed close beside you, were also part of this blanket and straw defense. Their shared body heat became another vital layer, a collective warmth that was more powerful than any individual covering. Children, wrapped in rags, slept soundly, their small bodies radiating surprising heat. As the night deepened and the fire dwindled to the merest glow, the hut would grow steadily colder. Frost might gather on the inside of the roof timbers, a glistening white layer that testified to the biting chill outside. But beneath your blankets, nestled in the straw, there was a fragile core of warmth maintained by sheer will, and the accumulated layers of whatever materials could be scavenged and spun. The blankets of wool and straw were more than just bedding. They were the essential, often inadequate, shields against the brutal reality of the medieval night. They were a testament to ingenuity, to persistence, to the endless, weary fight against the cold that defined so much of the peasant's existence. And as you pulled them tighter, feeling their familiar weight, you understood that each scrap, each fiber, was a small, vital defense against the encroaching darkness and the relentless chill. Sleeping in shifts. In the heart of the medieval night, when the world outside the peasant's hut was a realm of profound darkness and biting cold, sleep was not a collective, uninterrupted luxury. It was a strategic resource, a carefully managed vulnerability. For many families, especially during the harshest winters, the fire, the single source of warmth and light, could not be allowed to die completely. This necessity often led to a quiet, unspoken agreement. Sleeping in shifts, a cycle of vigilance where some rested while others remained awake, tending the fragile flame, watching for threats both seen and unseen. As the hearth fire dwindled to a glow of embers after the evening meal, the family would settle onto their straw beds, but not everyone would surrender to sleep immediately. One adult, often the patriarch or perhaps the eldest child if capable, would remain awake, a solitary sentinel in the flickering gloom. Their role was critical: to feed the fire, to ensure its embers did not die entirely, and to listen. The designated watcher would sit close to the hearth, wrapped in a heavy blanket, his face a shadowed mask in the dim light. His eyes, though heavy with weariness, would remain open, scanning the indistinct shapes of the hut. His ears would be tuned to every sound, the soft, rhythmic breathing of his sleeping family, the rustle of straw from the animals in their byre, and, most importantly, the subtle sounds from outside. The quiet of the hut was profound, broken only by the gentle crackle of the embers and the distant murmur of the wind. In this stillness, every sound from beyond the shuttered door became amplified, charged with potential meaning. The snap of a twig in the nearby woods, a deer, or something more menacing. The distant, mournful howl of a wolf. How close was it? The shifting of a loose plank in the wall. Just the wind, or something more? The watcher's hands, though tired, would periodically reach for the small bundle of kindling, carefully placing a dry twig or a small piece of wood onto the embers. The sudden, brief flare of light, the quickening of the fire's breath, was a small victory against the encroaching cold. It brought a fleeting moment of brighter illumination, briefly pushing back the shadows before they crept in again. The shift was often long, stretching for hours in the profound silence. Boredom and the powerful pull of sleep were constant battles. The watcher might hum a low, ancient tune to himself, or recite a quiet prayer, words whispered into the smoky air to keep his mind alert. He might gaze at the vast, indifferent stars that sometimes peeked through a crack in the thatch, a reminder of the immense, uncaring universe outside their small, fragile world. After a set period, often marked by the feeling of the deep cold settling into the bones, or by some internal rhythm, the watcher would gently rouse the next person in the cycle. A light touch on the shoulder, a soft whisper. The transfer of vigilance was a quiet, almost ritualistic passing of the guard. The newly awakened person would rise, groaning softly, and take their place by the fire, allowing the previous watcher to finally collapse into a brief, exhausted sleep. This cycle of vigilance was a testament to the harsh realities of medieval life. It spoke of a world where security was not guaranteed, where warmth was a constant, desperate battle, and where the line between safety and danger was thin and easily breached. It was a communal act of survival born of necessity, ensuring that the fragile spark of the hearth and the even more fragile spark of life would be preserved through the longest, coldest hours of the night. The children slept through it all, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding around them, their innocence a fleeting luxury their parents fiercely protected. For the adults, however, sleep was always shallow, always interrupted, always tinged with an underlying current of awareness, a primal vigilance. As the hours dragged on and the final watcher tended the last, dwindling embers, the first faint hint of dawn would begin to appear at the cracks in the shuttered windows. A profound sense of relief would wash over them. The night had been endured, the fire had been kept alive, the cycle of vigilance had once again paid its grim, essential dividend, and in that quiet, communal endurance there was a deep, unspoken strength that carried them through the harshest nights. Sharing the bed. In the constricted world of the medieval peasant's hut, privacy was an unknown luxury, a concept as foreign as roasted swan or silken robes. As night descended and the biting cold deepened, bodies became the most effective defense against the relentless chill. Families did not merely sleep near each other, they huddled together, bodies pressed close, a tangled mass of humanity and animal warmth, creating a collective cocoon of heat for sheer survival. The bed itself was often a communal space, a long, shallow trough or simply a designated area on the packed earth floor, thickly layered with straw. Here, parents, children, and sometimes even elderly relatives would lie, side by side, head to foot, or in intertwined bundles. There was no room for individual comfort, only for collective necessity. The act of settling into bed was a careful, deliberate one. First, the outermost layers of rough woolen cloaks or tunics would be shed to be used as additional blankets. Then, each person would burrow into the straw, seeking the deepest, warmest pocket, pulling their thin, coarse blankets up to their chins. The most precious resource was the body heat of another. A mother would lie with her infants cradled to her chest, their small bodies radiating surprising warmth. Children would instinctively press close to their parents or to older siblings, their tiny hands clutching at the rough fabric of a tunic. A husband and wife would lie intertwined, their backs pressed together, their legs tangled, creating a single, larger mass of warmth against the pervasive cold. The benefits of this communal sleeping arrangement were undeniable. Each body, burning its own internal fire, contributed to the collective temperature. The air trapped between bodies, warmed and contained, became a precious resource. You could feel the warmth emanating from your husband's back, the small, insistent heat from a child tucked beneath your arm. It was a primal, animal warmth, a basic, human instinct for survival. The sounds of sleep were intimate and constant, the gentle rhythm of breathing, the occasional sigh, the rustle of straw as someone shifted their position. The closeness meant that every cough, every restless turn, every muttered word in sleep was shared. There was no escape from the sounds or the presence of others. The smells, too, were inescapable, the earthy scent of straw, the lingering wood smoke, the subtle, unique aroma of unwashed human skin, perhaps mingled with the faint tang of animal presence from the byre. These were the intimate perfumes of survival, the undeniable realities of life lived in such close quarters. The cold, however, was a persistent adversary. It found its way in through the cracks in the walls, seeped up from the damp earth, settled in the open spaces of the hut. Even pressed close, you would still feel the biting chill on an exposed ear, or the cold air seeping in as someone shifted away. The need for warmth was constant, an underlying current beneath the surface of sleep. Sometimes a child would stir, crying softly from the cold or a nightmare, and your hand would reach out in the darkness, pulling them closer, offering the reassuring warmth of your own body. This constant physical contact, born of necessity, also forged a profound emotional bond, a deep sense of mutual reliance. The thought of privacy of a bed to oneself was almost unimaginable. It would mean certain unbearable cold, a solitary battle against the chill that no single body, no matter how many blankets, could truly win. Sharing the bed was not a choice. It was a fundamental requirement for enduring the long, harsh nights. As the deepest hours of the night passed, and the embers in the hearth dwindled to a near total darkness, the hut would grow steadily colder. Frost might gather on the inside of the roof, and each breath would hang heavy in the air. But under the rough woolen blankets nestled in the straw, the tangled mass of bodies created a core of enduring warmth, a defiant pocket of life against the overwhelming indifference of the outside world. Families huddled together, bodies pressed close, their shared warmth a fragile shield. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of medieval peasant sleep, a testament to the primal human drive for connection and survival in the face of brutal, unyielding hardship. And in that intimate, collective warmth, there was a profound sense of security, a small, essential victory against the long, cold night. The breath of winter. The hut, shuttered and barred, might offer a semblance of shelter, a fragile boundary between the living and the elemental forces beyond. But as the medieval night deepened, especially in the relentless grip of winter, the cold found its way in. It was a pervasive, insidious presence, felt not just on the skin, but in the very air that you breathed. This was the breath of winter gathering on the rafters, making each exhale hang heavy and visible in the profound chill. You lay on your straw bed, huddled close to your family, wrapped in every available blanket, yet the cold still crept in. It seeped up from the damp earth floor, radiated inwards from the mud-daubed walls, and drifted down from the ill-fitting thatch of the roof. It was a cold that gnawed at the bones, a persistent ache that settled deep within the marrow, defying the thin layers of protection. Gazing upwards into the profound darkness of the hut, a ghostly luminescence would sometimes catch your eye. On the rough-hewn timbers of the roof frame, on the exposed underside of the thatch, a delicate, crystalline filigree had formed. Frost! It glittered faintly in the scant light from the dying embers, a testament to the cold's undeniable presence, a stark reminder of the battle being lost. Each tiny shard of ice was a frozen breath of the outside world, solidifying within your fragile sanctuary. Your own breath, when exhaled, would bloom in the air like ghost smoke, curling upwards in a visible cloud before slowly dissipating. The children's quiet sighs, the rhythmic snores of your husband, all were momentarily given form, fleeting assertions of warmth against the overwhelming chill. You could feel the moist vapor of your own lungs, cold on your lips as you exhaled, then warm as you inhaled the air that had been slightly warmed by bodies and the dwindling hearth. The air itself felt heavy, thick with moisture and cold. It carried the earthy scent of damp straw, the lingering wood smoke, and the subtle, close aroma of human and animal bodies. This was the air you breathed for hours, stagnant yet constantly renewed by the subtle draughts that found their way through every crack and crevice. The wind, a restless spirit, sighed and groaned around the hut, its unseen force pressing against the walls, testing the integrity of the shutters. You could hear it whistling through the gaps in the thatch, a thin, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness of the world outside. Sometimes a fine powder of frozen moisture, or even a few flakes of snow, would sift down through a particularly weak spot in the roof, landing on the straw with a barely audible whisper. The chill was unrelenting. Even with bodies pressed close, even with layers of rough wool, the cold found its way to your extremities. Your feet, often bare or wrapped in thin rags, would grow numb. Your hands, tucked under your armpits, would slowly lose their warmth. The desire for light, for the sun's distant, indifferent heat, became an almost unbearable yearning. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, punctuated by shivers and restless turns. You would wake with a start, feeling an icy draft on your face or the creeping chill on your back. The struggle for warmth was a subconscious, relentless battle waged through the long, dark hours. The breath of winter was not merely the temperature, it was a profound bodily experience of vulnerability, of constant exposure. The frost on the rafters, the visible breath in the air, these were not just physical phenomena. They were psychological markers of the deep winter night, reminding you of the immense, indifferent forces of nature that constantly pressed against your small, fragile existence. They underscored the constant precarity, the thin line between survival and succumbing to the elements. Part 3. The sounds beyond the door, the barking of dogs. The darkness beyond the peasant's hut was not merely the absence of light. It was a vast, unmapped realm of uncertainty and potential peril. With the door barred and the windows shuttered, the sense of confinement was profound, but it also sharpened the other senses, particularly hearing. And in the oppressive silence of the medieval night, few sounds could cut through the gloom with such sudden, visceral impact as the barking of dogs. A sudden noise outside, was it thief, beast, or spirit, would instantly snap you from sleep, leaving a cold dread clutching at your heart. You would be deep in the fitful sleep of exhaustion, bodies pressed close for warmth when it would begin. A low, tentative growl from a distant farm dog, then a sharp, alarmed bark. And then, as if a spark had ignited a chain, a chorus of barks would erupt across the scattered village, sharp, frantic, echoing through the profound stillness. Your eyes would snap open, instantly alert, your heart thumping a heavy rhythm against your ribs. Every muscle would tense. Your husband beside you would stir, a low grunt escaping his lips, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy cudgel or axe kept close by the straw bed. The children perhaps might whimper softly, roused by the sudden commotion, pulling closer to the perceived safety of their parents' bodies. The barking was not the playful yapping of day. This was the deep, urgent bark of alarm, a desperate warning. It was raw, primal, a sound that spoke directly to ancient, hardwired fears. The dogs, whether your own thin cur curled by the hearth or those of your neighbours, were the village's first line of defence, their keen senses far surpassing human perception in the dark. They smelled, heard, and sensed threats long before any human could. You would lie absolutely still, straining your ears, trying to discern the nuances in the barking. Was it the low, aggressive growl that meant a wolf or a bear? Or the high-pitched, frantic yelps that suggested human intruders, a bandit, a desperate thief, or something worse? The uncertainty was agonizing, filling the small, dark hut with a palpable tension. Sometimes the barking would be localized, confined to one part of the village, hinting at a specific threat. Other times it would spread, a wave of noise washing over the entire settlement, suggesting a wider, more pervasive danger. You could almost feel the dogs out there, silhouetted against the dark, their hackles raised, their barks defiant against the unseen forces of the night. The sounds were amplified by the thick walls and the closed shutters. Each bark seemed to penetrate your very bones, vibrating through the packed earth floor. The profound silence that would occasionally follow a burst of barking was almost more terrifying. A sudden, chilling cessation that suggested the threat had passed, or, worse, had moved silently, stealthily, closer. Your husband would rise slowly, cautiously, making sure not to wake the children fully. He would move to the shuttered door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar, listening intently. His face, a grim mask in the near-total darkness, would be a mirror of your own fear. The cudgel would be gripped tight, a heavy, crude defense against the unknown. The fear was not just of physical harm, it was also of the unseen, the spiritual. In a world permeated by belief in malevolent spirits, in forest creatures that blurred the line between animal and demon, the dog's alarm could mean more than just a mortal threat. It could be a warning of something unholy, something that no axe or cudgel could truly deter. The line between beast, bandit, and spirit was often blurred in the anxious mind of a medieval peasant. After what felt like an eternity, the barking would often begin to subside. One by one, the dogs would quiet, their warnings fading into a low, uncertain growl, then into a profound stillness once more. The immediate threat, whatever it had been, had passed. For now. A deep, collective sigh of relief would ripple through the hut, an unspoken acknowledgement of the terror weathered. Your husband would return to the straw bed, his body still tense, but the immediate crisis averted. You would pull the blankets tighter, your heart still pounding, trying to coax sleep back to your shaken body. The barking of dogs in the night was a stark, visceral reminder of the constant, palpable dangers that pressed in on all sides. It was the sound of a world without strong walls, without law, without reliable protection. It was the medieval night speaking its brutal truth, a sudden, terrifying question whispered through the darkness. Was it thief, beast, or spirit? and the silence that followed offered no easy answers, only a profound, weary gratitude for another night survived. The wind at the rafters. Even with the thick, mud-daubed walls and the barred door, the peasant's hut offered only a fragile barrier against the elemental forces of the medieval night. The wind, a relentless and unseen presence, was a constant reminder of this vulnerability. As it swirled and howled around the dwelling, every groan of wood, every creak of the roof timbers felt like a hand pressing against the house, a giant, invisible force attempting to pry open your fragile sanctuary. You lay on your straw bed deep in the night, the warmth of your family a small comfort against the pervasive cold. But sleep was shallow, easily broken by the insistent symphony of the wind. It began as a low moan, a distant sigh that crept around the eaves. Then it would rise, gathering strength, turning into a mournful whistle as it found gaps in the thatch, an insistent whine as it probed the cracks in the wooden shutters. Soon the wind would gain full voice, a roaring, howling gale that seemed to encompass the entire hut. It was a sound that was both primal and deeply unsettling. The old timbers of the roof, salvaged and rough-hewn, would groan and creak under its relentless pressure. The rafters, lashed together with rope or held by simple wooden pegs, would protest, their joints moaning with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath you. Each groan of wood felt personal, as if the hut itself was alive, struggling against an unseen assailant. You would listen, your heart thumping, for any sound that suggested a failure. The sudden snap of a rafter, the terrifying creak of a support beam giving way, the ominous rustle of thatch being ripped away. The integrity of the roof was paramount. Without it, the bitter cold and driving rain or snow would quickly render the hut uninhabitable. The wind was not just a sound, it was a physical presence. You could feel its relentless pressure against the walls, the subtle trembling of the whole structure. It drove the cold relentlessly through every tiny crack and crevice, making the air inside the hut feel even more frigid despite the lingering warmth of bodies and banked embers. Fine dust, or even flakes of dried straw, might sift down from the thatch, carried by the invisible currents. For the children, nestled deep in sleep, the wind's howling could sometimes penetrate their dreams, stirring them to a fretful whimpering. You would pull them closer, whispering reassurances, though your own heart was often filled with the same unease. For the adults, the wind was a constant, unwelcome reminder of their precarious existence, of the thin line that separated their fragile shelter from the vast, untamed elements. The roar of the wind would sometimes be punctuated by other sounds it carried. The eerie, distant screech of an owl caught in its currents, the sharp snap of a branch breaking in the nearby forest, or the chilling rattle of loose debris being hurled against the hut's walls. Each sound added to the terrifying symphony, a relentless assault on your sense of safety. This was not merely bad weather, it was the raw power of nature, unchecked by human mastery, demanding respect and instilling fear. In a world where the very act of building was a monumental effort, and repairs were constant battles, the wind's relentless force was a constant threat to the structural integrity of your home. Your husband, if he was awake, would lie tense beside you, his ear pressed to the straw, listening to the groans and creaks, assessing the threat. His vigilance was a shared burden, an unspoken worry that hung in the thick, smoky air. The strength of the hut, its ability to withstand such a storm, felt directly tied to the strength of your own will, your own determination to endure. After hours that felt like an eternity, the wind would sometimes begin to subside, its howling diminishing to a mournful moan, then to a whisper. A profound sense of relief would wash over you, a deep, weary gratitude that the hut had held. You would drift into a more settled sleep, but the memory of the wind's relentless assault would linger, a chilling testament to the fragile shields against darkness. The wind at the rafters was more than just a natural phenomenon. It was a potent symbol of the constant battle for survival, the never-ending fight against a world that sought to break you. Every groan of wood, every creak of timber echoed the profound vulnerability of medieval peasant life, a stark reminder that even the simplest dwelling was a triumph against the elements, a testament to enduring human will in the face of an uncaring world. The cry of wolves. Of all the sounds that pierced the profound stillness of the medieval night, few could grip the peasant's heart with such primal terror as the cry of wolves. It was a sound that resonated deep within the ancient fears of humanity, a chilling reminder of the raw, untamed wilderness that constantly pressed against the fragile boundaries of the village. Distant howls, mournful and predatory, spoke of dangers waiting in the dark forest, a stark testament to the ever-present threat. You would be deep in a restless sleep, perhaps dreaming of the day's endless toil when it would begin. A solitary howl, long and drawn out, a mournful lament that seemed to rise from the very depths of the dark forest. Then a pause, a tense silence, before another joined, and then another, until a chilling chorus echoed through the night. The sound would pierce the thick walls of the hut, sending a cold shiver down your spine, instantly waking you. Your body would tense, every muscle taut, your heart hammering against your ribs. Your husband beside you would stir, a low growl escaping his throat, his eyes wide and alert in the darkness. The children, perhaps, would whimper softly, roused by the sudden, unsettling noise, their small hands clutching at your rough tunic. Even the animals in their byre, usually restless, would fall silent, their senses acutely tuned to the distant danger, their collective stillness almost more terrifying than the howls themselves. The cries were not just sounds, they were a declaration of hunger, a symbol of the untamed wilderness reclaiming its domain. Wolves were a constant, tangible threat to the peasants' meagre livestock, the precious sheep, the invaluable goat, even the scrawny cow. A single, successful raid could spell disaster for a family, stealing away a crucial source of warmth, milk, and future sustenance. You would lie absolutely still, straining your ears, trying to gauge the distance, the direction, the intensity of the howls. Were they far off, a distant warning? Or were they closer, too close, circling the edges of the village, their keen senses already scenting the warmth of the animals, the presence of vulnerable life? The wind, if it blew from the forest, seemed to carry their chilling calls directly into the hut, making them feel even more immediate, more menacing. The fire, reduced to its faintest embers, offered no real light against such a primal darkness, no warmth against such a bone-deep fear. The shuttered door, the thick walls, they felt suddenly fragile, insufficient against the ancient, predatory intelligence that lurked outside. Your husband would rise slowly, carefully, his movements hushed. He would move to the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar, his ear pressed against the rough timber. He would listen, his breath held, trying to discern any subtle shift in the sounds, the soft pad of paws, the rustle of dry leaves, the sudden, frantic bleat of a distant animal. The cudgel or axe, kept close by, would be gripped tight, its cold weight a small, grim comfort. The children, if they were truly awake, would stare wide-eyed into the darkness, their small imaginations filling the vast night with monstrous forms. You would pull them closer, murmuring reassurances, trying to project a calm you did not feel. The fear was infectious, a cold, creeping sensation that settled in the pit of your stomach. Sometimes the howling would recede, fading back into the deep forest, leaving behind a profound, almost echoing silence. A collective sigh of relief, often unspoken, would ripple through the hut. The immediate threat had passed, for now. But the memory of the cries would linger, a chilling reminder of the fragile line between human settlement and the encroaching wild. The forest, a source of vital firewood and occasional forage, was also a reservoir of ancient, untamed dangers. The wolves were its fiercest guardians, a constant, tangible manifestation of the world's indifference to human struggle. You would eventually drift back into a fitful sleep, but it would be a lighter slumber, tinged with an underlying current of vigilance. The sound of wolves was more than just a nocturnal noise. It was a profound, visceral declaration of the medieval night's inherent brutality. A stark reminder that even within the walls of your humble hut, surrounded by your family, you were never truly safe from the dangers that waited patiently in the dark. The cry of wolves echoed, a harrowing song of survival and fear. Part 3. The Sounds Beyond the Door, the Watchman's Call. In the profound, often terrifying silence of the medieval night, the sudden rhythmic call of the watchman was not a disruption, but a profound reassurance. It was a human voice cutting through the primal darkness, a beacon of vigilance that offered a fragile sense of order and community. Occasional voices in the night gave reassurance that someone was awake, standing guard against the myriad unseen threats that lurked just beyond the light of the hearth. You would lie awake, perhaps, or be stirred from a fitful sleep by the wind, by the cold, or by some subtle, unsettling noise from outside. The hut would be in near total darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers. The sounds of your family's breathing, the rustle of straw, the distant murmur of the sleeping animals. These were the intimate sounds of your personal world. But beyond the shuttered door, the night felt vast, silent, and dangerous. Then carried on the cold night air. It would come. A voice. All's well, or the third hour passes, and all is quiet. The words were simple, often repeated, sometimes muffled by distance or by the howling wind, but their meaning was clear and instantly comforting. Someone was out there. Someone was awake. Someone was watching. The watchman was not a soldier of the king, not a knight in shining armor. He was a villager, chosen for his reliability, armed with a heavy staff and perhaps a horn, his only uniform a thick woolen cloak against the biting cold. He would walk the rough perimeter of the village, treading familiar paths, his eyes scanning the gloom, his ears acutely tuned to any unusual sound. His call was a crucial part of the communal defense, a deterrent to both two-legged and four-legged predators. The sound of his voice, rough and human, was a profound relief after the unsettling silence of the wild. It pushed back, momentarily, against the imagined terrors of the dark. It dispelled the fear of isolation, reminding you that you were part of a larger, collective effort to survive the long night. The knowledge that a pair of human eyes were scanning the same shadows that your own imagination populated with monsters was a powerful solace. You might hear him pass close to your hut, his footsteps soft on the muddy path, the faint swish of his cloak before his voice would rise again, a little further off, proclaiming the quiet passage of time. Each call marked another hour endured, another segment of the night successfully navigated. It was a rhythm of vigilance, a slow, comforting drumbeat against the vast, indifferent darkness. For the children, the watchman's call, though sometimes startling, quickly became a sound of reassurance. It was a guardian's voice, a familiar anchor in the uncertainty of the night. It taught them in a subtle way, that even in the face of fear there was order, there was vigilance, there was protection. The wind, if it howled, sometimes swallowed the call, leaving a longer, more anxious wait for the next declaration. Your ears would strain, listening intently, feeling a tightening in your chest, until his voice, however faint, finally carried again. The absence of the call was almost as unsettling as any threatening noise, raising fears that he had fallen prey to the very dangers he sought to guard against. But when it came, it brought a fleeting sense of peace. You would close your eyes, pulling the rough blanket tighter, allowing yourself to sink deeper into the straw. The presence of the watchman meant that for a few more moments you could surrender to sleep, trusting that someone else bore the burden of vigilance. The sudden silence. The medieval night was rarely truly silent. There was always the distant rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind, the faint creaks of the hut, the snuffling of animals, or the ubiquitous chirping of insects. These were the background hum of a world without constant artificial noise, a natural symphony that, though sometimes unsettling, was also familiar and therefore comforting. But then it would happen, a sudden, profound silence. When even the animals quieted, an inexplicable hush would descend, and a chilling unease would creep through the hut, more terrifying than any specific sound. You would be lying on your straw bed, perhaps on the cusp of sleep, listening to the familiar sounds of the night, the rhythmic chewing of the cow in its byre, the soft, contented clucking of the chickens, the faint scratching of a mouse in the thatch. These were the reassurances of continuous life, mundane but vital. Then, without warning, they would cease. The chewing would stop. The clucking would fade. The scratching would halt. An absolute, heavy silence would fall, so profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the hut. It was a silence deeper than the absence of sound. It was the active, terrifying cessation of all life's usual murmurs. Your eyes would snap open, instantly alert. Your heart would begin to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against your ribs. Every muscle in your body would tense. Your husband, beside you, would also be awake, his breathing shallow, his hand instinctively reaching for the axe kept near the bed. Even the children perhaps would stir, their small bodies rigid, sensing the unspoken fear that filled the hut. This sudden silence was deeply unsettling because it was unnatural. Animals, with their primal instincts, sensed danger long before humans. Their abrupt quietude was a profound warning, an undeniable signal that something was amiss, something so threatening that it had driven even the most common creatures into a terrified stillness. You would lie there, absolutely motionless, straining your ears in the profound quiet. The silence itself felt watchful, predatory, as if the very air outside was holding its breath, listening for your own. Your mind would race, cycling through all the potential horrors. A wolf, silent and cunning, circling the hut. A bandit, stealthy and deadly, approaching the door. Some supernatural entity, its presence so overwhelming that it had silenced the very life around it. The darkness of the hut, once familiar, now felt suffocating, filled with imagined horrors. The faint glow of the embers seemed to shrink, offering no real light against the heavy gloom. The wooden walls, the barred door, the layers of thatch, they felt suddenly porous, thin, offering little defense against the unknown terror that had imposed such a terrifying quiet. Your husband would eventually rise, slowly, cautiously, making no sound. He would creep to the shuttered door, his ear pressed against the wood, listening. His face, a grim mask in the near-total darkness, would convey the depth of his apprehension. The axe, gripped tight in his hand, seemed a pitiful defense against such an amorphous threat. The silence would persist, stretching for what felt like an eternity. The absence of sound was more terrifying than any howl or bark, for it left everything to the imagination, filling the void with the most ancient and visceral of fears. It was the sound of a predator at the threshold, unseen, unheard, but undeniably present. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the silence might break. A single, tentative chirp from a cricket, a soft rustle from the chickens in their coop, the slow, rhythmic chewing of the cow. The gradual return of the familiar sounds was a profound, overwhelming relief. The threat, whatever it had been, had passed. For now, a collective, unspoken sigh would ripple through the hut. Your husband would slowly return to the straw bed, his body still tense, but the immediate crisis averted. You would pull the blankets tighter, your heart still pounding, trying to coax sleep back to your shaken body, knowing that the memory of that sudden, terrifying silence would linger long into the morning. The sudden silence, when even the animals quieted, was a primal, chilling warning. It was the sound of danger at its most insidious, its most unsettling. It underscored the profound vulnerability of medieval peasant life, a stark reminder that in a world without absolute safety, the absence of sound could often be the most terrifying sound of all. The winter cough. Winter, the harshest season, brought with it a host of new anxieties beyond hunger and cold. In the cramped, smoky confines of the medieval peasant's hut, where human and animal warmth mingled, illness spread with terrifying ease. A cough, at first a minor irritation, could quickly become a harbinger of dread, echoing through the long, dark nights. Its sound a constant, chilling reminder of vulnerability and death. It would begin subtly, perhaps a dry tickle in the throat, dismissed at first as the inevitable chill of the season. But then it would deepen, becoming a persistent, racking cough, racking the chest, making breath a painful struggle. In the close, stagnant air of the hut, where bodies huddled together for warmth, where ventilation was sacrificed for heat, the illness would take hold, easily jumping from one person to the next. The sound of the cough, sharp and insistent, would pierce the stillness of the night. You would lie awake, listening to your child, or your husband, or an elderly parent, struggling for breath, their chest rattling with an ominous wetness. Each fit of coughing would send a cold dread clutching at your heart. Sleep, already a fragile commodity, would be further broken, punctuated by the distressing sounds of illness. The smoky air of the hut, a constant companion, offered a perverse comfort in its warmth, but it was also a significant contributor to the spread and severity of respiratory ailments. The persistent inhalation of wood smoke irritated the lungs, making them more susceptible to infection. The lack of clean air, the dampness, the constant chill, these were the perfect breeding grounds for illness. There was little effective medicine. The village healer might offer a bitter herbal tea or a foul-smelling poultice for the chest, but her remedies were often more about comfort and hope than cure. The priest might offer prayers, but even his blessings felt futile against the relentless grip of a persistent cough that deepened with each passing day. The fear was palpable. A simple winter cough was rarely simple. It could quickly descend into a chest fever, a pneumonia that would steal the breath with terrifying speed, especially from the young and the old, whose bodies were already weakened by hunger and endless toil. You had seen it before, a cough that started innocently, only to end in a shallow grave on the cold, hard earth. When a child fell ill, the anxiety was almost unbearable. Their small bodies, already fragile, struggled against the relentless assault. Their cries, their fevered moans, They're gasping for breath. These were the sounds that tore at the heart of a parent. You would hold them close, rocking them gently, whispering reassurances, trying to transfer your own meager warmth, but feeling utterly helpless against the invisible enemy. The illness of one person impacted the entire family. The sick needed tending, a constant drain on the already limited resources of time and energy. The fear of contagion was also present, even if poorly understood. Would the cough spread? Would it take hold of another? Every sniffle, every sneeze became a source of renewed anxiety. The long, dark hours of the night seemed to stretch interminably when someone was ill. The sounds of their suffering filled the hut, amplifying your own helplessness. The warmth of the fire, the collective warmth of bodies, felt insufficient against the internal cold of fever. The shadows cast by the dying embers seemed to deepen, taking on a more ominous quality, reflecting the despair that gnawed at the edges of your hope. As dawn approached, a heavy, weary relief would settle. Another night endured, but the cough would still be there, a persistent, chilling reminder that the battle was far from over. The winter cough was more than just a sickness. It was a profound symbol of the fragility of life, of the immense challenges faced by ordinary people in a world stripped bare of effective remedies and sanitation. Illness spread easily in crowded, smoky huts where warmth and sickness mixed, a brutal reality that constantly threatened to claim those who had already defied so many other dangers. And as the cough echoed through the hut, a haunting sound in the encroaching dawn, you knew that the battle for health, like the battle for food and warmth, was a constant, weary, often losing fight against the relentless hardships of the medieval night. Part 4. Fear of Illness and Spirits, the Midwife's Vigil. In a world where medical science was almost non-existent, and the fragility of life was a daily reality, birth was a terrifying, perilous journey undertaken almost entirely by women. When a child stirred to enter the world, especially in the long, dark hours of night, it was a moment of intense drama and profound fear. The midwife, a figure of vital importance and ancient knowledge, would begin her vigil, her presence a thin but powerful shield between life and death, with lives trembling in the balance. The call would come in the deep of night, a frantic, hushed knock on the door, a whispered plea. You would rise, your stomach tightening with a familiar dread, grab your warmest cloak, and follow the nervous messenger through the dark, cold village. The hut where the birth was beginning would be already tense, filled with a palpable mixture of fear and anticipation. Stepping inside, the air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and the distinct, coppery tang of blood. The birthing woman, often your neighbor or a relative, would lie on a bed of straw by the hearth, her face contorted in pain, her body racked by contractions. Other women, her family and close friends, would huddle nearby, murmuring prayers, offering comfort, but ultimately helpless. The midwife, however, was a force of quiet authority and calm competence. She was an older woman, her hands gnarled by years of work, but her touch firm and knowing. Her face, etched with countless vigils, would be focused, her eyes sharp and constantly assessing. She carried a small pouch of vital tools, clean linen scraps, a sharp knife for the umbilical cord, and small bundles of herbs, comfrey for pain, ergot for blood loss, chamomile for calming. Her knowledge was not from books, but from generations of lived experience, passed down through whispers and practical lessons. She would take charge, her low, steady voice cutting through the cries of the laboring woman and the hushed prayers of the onlookers. She would apply warm compresses, offer sips of herbal tea, encourage deep breaths. Her hands, though rough, moved with a surprising delicacy, guiding, supporting, monitoring the slow, arduous progress of the birth. The vigil would stretch for hours, sometimes through the entire night. The fire, kept burning as brightly as possible, cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock the profound struggle unfolding by its light. Each cry of the laboring woman, each gasp for breath, was a physical manifestation of the precarious balance between life and death. The air would be heavy with unspoken fear, with the desperate hope that both mother and child would survive. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a journey fraught with immense danger. Infection, hemorrhage, prolonged labor. These were common killers, often claiming both mother and infant. The midwife knew these dangers intimately. She watched for the subtle signs. She made her desperate, often futile, interventions, her knowledge the only barrier against a swift, brutal end. The whispered prayers of the women gathered would grow more fervent, blending with ancient charms, and incantations meant to ward off evil spirits, to ensure an easy passage, to bless the new life. Faith and folk wisdom intertwined, a desperate attempt to exert some control over an event so profoundly beyond human command. And then, if God willed it, a new sound would pierce the night, a wail, thin but insistent, the cry of a newborn. A collective gasp, then a deep, shuddering sigh of relief would ripple through the hut. The midwife, her face gleaming with sweat and exhaustion, would cradle the tiny, vulnerable form, carefully cutting the cord, cleaning the infant. The first sight of the new life, small and red and struggling, was a profound moment, erasing the night's fears with the sudden, overwhelming miracle of existence. But even then, the vigil was not entirely over. The afterbirth needed to be delivered, the mother cared for, the infant kept warm and fed. The midwife would stay watching, nurturing, ensuring the fragile spark of life held firm. As dawn approached, the first pale light seeping through the cracks in the shutters, the midwife would finally rest, her face weary but triumphant. 2 lives, all one, had been steered through the perilous passage of the night. Her vigil, an act of immense strength and profound skill, was a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of nature's brutal indifference. Night births tested both strength and faith, with lives trembling in the balance. The midwife, with her ancient knowledge and unwavering resolve, was the silent hero of these profound moments, a guardian of the fragile future, ensuring that life, however precarious, found a way to continue in the heart of the medieval night. The evil in dreams. Sleep, in the medieval peasant's hut, was rarely a time of profound rest and peace. It was shallow, broken by cold, hunger, and the constant anxieties of survival. But even when exhaustion claimed you, the mind offered no true escape. Dreams, vivid and often terrifying, were not dismissed as mere subconscious wanderings. They were taken as potent warnings, messages from the spirit world, portents of curses, sickness, or death to come. The boundary between the waking world and the realm of the nocturnal mind was thin, permeable, and filled with potential evil. You would stir from a nightmare, your heart pounding, your body slick with a cold sweat, a silent scream caught in your throat. The hut would be in absolute darkness, the embers long since faded to nothing. The familiar shapes of your sleeping family would be indistinct, and for a terrifying moment, the oppressive gloom would seem to hold the spectral forms of your dream. The dream itself would be vivid, chilling in its detail. Perhaps you saw a beloved child, their face pale and lifeless, lying cold on the straw, or a shadowy figure, cloaked and menacing, lurking at the edge of the forest, its eyes burning with malevolence. Maybe you dreamt of a ruined harvest, fields blighted, or the terrifying sight of your hut consumed by fire. These were not random images. They were believed to be visitations, communications from forces beyond human understanding. In a world deeply intertwined with Christian belief, but also retaining strong undercurrents of older pagan faiths and superstitions, dreams were often seen as battlegrounds. Demons, spirits, and malevolent fairies could invade the sleeping mind, planting seeds of fear, tempting the soul, or delivering dire warnings. The devil himself was thought to roam most freely in the hours of deepest darkness, his influence reaching even into the sanctuary of sleep. You would lie still, trembling, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of the nightmare. The images would burn behind your eyelids, refusing to dissipate. The cold of the night would feel sharper, more menacing, imbued with the terror of your dream. The sounds of the hut, the rustle of straw, the occasional creak of timber, would seem amplified, imbued with a sinister meaning. Whispering a hurried prayer, you might cross yourself, or clutch a small, crude crucifix hidden beneath your blanket. Perhaps you would reach for a protective charm, a piece of consecrated wood or a dried herb, hoping its power would ward off the lingering evil of the dream. The sense of vulnerability was profound. Even in sleep, you were not safe. When dawn finally broke, casting its pale light into the hut, the dream would still cling to you, its shadow refusing to lift. You would share it perhaps with your husband, or with the village healer, or even with the priest if he was visiting. The telling of the dream was an important ritual, a way to externalize the fear, to seek interpretation and solace. The healer might offer an explanation rooted in the body's humors, or a specific herbal draught to promote more peaceful sleep. The priest might interpret it as a temptation, a test of faith, or a divine warning requiring extra prayer or penance, but all would agree the dream was not to be taken lightly. It held meaning. The lingering fear of a bad dream could cast a pall over the entire day. You would watch your children more closely, inspect your meager harvest with a renewed sense of anxiety, and regard any unexpected visitor with heightened suspicion. The dream, once dismissed, now held a potent sway over your waking hours, shaping your actions, fueling your anxieties. The evil in dreams was a constant, intimate source of fear, a reminder that the dangers of the medieval night extended beyond the physical. It spoke of a world where the spiritual and the physical were inextricably linked, where the line between reality and the supernatural was blurred. It was a profound testament to the power of belief, to the deep-seated anxieties that permeated the lives of ordinary people, even in the sanctuary of their own minds. The whisper of charms. In the medieval peasant's hut, surrounded by the overwhelming forces of cold, hunger, sickness, and the unseen dangers of the night, raw faith in God was a constant. But alongside the prayers and blessings of the church, there existed an older, more primal layer of protection, the whisper of charms. These were the everyday magic, the folk remedies, the small, tangible defenses against a world believed to be teeming with malevolent spirits, curses, and the unpredictable whims of fate. Herbs and charms were hung above doors, placed under beds, or worn close to the skin, a fragile shield to keep shadows and ill fortune at bay. You would stand at the low, shuttered doorway of your hut, the biting wind sighing around you, and perform a small, ancient ritual. Tucked into the thatch above the lintel, or nailed to the rough wooden doorpost, would be a bundle of dried herbs, sprigs of rowan, garlic bulbs, perhaps a twisted piece of vervain. These were gathered with care, often in specific phases of the moon, their power believed to be strongest when collected under the right celestial conditions. Their presence, though offering no physical barrier, was a symbolic defense, a whispered prayer to ward off evil. Inside the hut, other charms would be strategically placed. A smooth, river-washed stone, perhaps with a natural hole through its center, might be tied with a thread and hung above the children's sleeping area, believed to protect them from nightmares and malevolent spirits that preyed on the innocent. A small, carefully crafted straw doll, sometimes adorned with a feather or a piece of colourful thread, might be hidden in a corner, a ward against the evil eye, or a curse placed by a jealous neighbour. The village healer, with her deep knowledge of both herbal lore and folk magic, was often the source of these charms. She would prescribe specific herbs to be burned, their pungent smoke believed to cleanse the air of sickness and evil. She might create a small leather pouch filled with a secret mix of protective herbs, a dried insect, or a tiny fragment of bone to be worn around the neck or sewn into the lining of a garment, a constant, intimate shield against unseen threats. The effectiveness of these charms was rarely questioned. In a world where cause and effect were often mysterious, where a sudden illness or a blighted crop seemed to appear without logical reason, such simple, tangible protections offered a vital sense of control. They were a way for ordinary people to feel they had some agency against the overwhelming forces that governed their lives. The air in the hut, thick with wood smoke and the scent of human and animal presence, would also carry the subtle, often medicinal aroma of these herbs. It was a smell that mingled faith and superstition, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that were believed to permeate the very fabric of existence. Before settling down for the night, or upon waking from a particularly disturbing dream, you might perform a small personal ritual. A quiet whisper to the charm above the door, a touch of your fingers to the smooth river stone, a silent prayer to the protective herbs. These were moments of intense personal belief, a seeking of comfort and protection from the unseen world. For the children, these charms were part of the fabric of their world, their meaning absorbed implicitly. They learned to respect the protective power of the rowan, to avoid disturbing the small straw doll, to understand that the world was full of forces, both good and ill, that required constant vigilance and the right kind of defense. The whisper of charms was not a replacement for prayer to God, but a complementary layer of protection. It was a fusion of ancient beliefs with newer Christian ones, a reflection of the pragmatic spirituality of a people living on the edge of survival. It was a means to find strength, to ward off fear, to feel a sense of security in the face of an unpredictable and often terrifying world. As the deep darkness of the medieval night pressed against the fragile walls of the hut, and the wind sighed through the cracks, the quiet presence of these charms, imbued with generations of belief, offered a profound sense of comfort. Herbs and charms, hung above doors and hidden in corners, were the whispered shield against the shadows, a powerful testament to the enduring human need for protection against the unknown, the malevolent, and the inexplicable. The toll of a bell. In the vast, overwhelming silence of the medieval night, when the world outside the peasant's hut was a realm of profound darkness and unquantifiable fears, sound carried with startling clarity. And few sounds held such potent, immediate meaning as the distant toll of a bell. Each chime, slow and mournful, echoing through the cold, still air, was a stark, chilling pronouncement. It meant sickness, fire, or death had visited the village, bringing the collective fears of the community into sharp, terrifying focus. You would be deep in the fitful sleep of exhaustion, perhaps finally finding a brief reprieve from the cold or hunger when it would begin. A solitary chime. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, another, and another. Slow, deliberate. Each sound cutting through the darkness with a chilling precision. Your eyes would snap open, your heart immediately pounding a heavy rhythm against your ribs. Your husband, beside you, would stir, his breath held, his face a grim mask in the near-total darkness. The children, if they woke, would whimper softly, sensing the palpable fear that had instantly filled the hut. The bell was an alarm, a death knell, a messenger of dread. The bell was not your own. Few peasant villages possessed such a luxury. It would belong to the nearest parish church, perhaps a day's walk away, or a more substantial monastery. Its sound, carried by the cold, still air of the night, spoke of a larger world, a larger community, but also of shared vulnerability. The number of tolls was often significant. 3 tolls, perhaps, for a child, 9 for an adult, a prolonged, frantic pealing for fire. The meaning was usually understood, even if the precise nature of the tragedy remained a terrifying mystery until dawn. The sound itself was enough to conjure images of suffering, a body racked by fever, a roof collapsing in flames, a loved one lying cold and still. You would lie absolutely motionless, straining your ears into the profound quiet that followed each chime. The silence between the tolls felt immense, heavy, filled with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. Who had it claimed? Which family? What misfortune had visited itself upon the community now? The cold of the night would feel sharper, more insidious, imbued with the terror of the bell's message. The warmth of the fire, the collective heat of bodies, would seem suddenly insufficient against the chilling pronouncement of death or disaster. The shuttered walls of the hut, usually a sanctuary, now felt porous, allowing the dread to seep in, unchecked. Your husband might rise, restless and uneasy. He would move to the door, his hand on the heavy bar, listening intently into the night. His vigil was one of helpless apprehension, a shared burden with every other family in the village. There was nothing to be done in the deep darkness, no way to ascertain the specific tragedy until the light of day. Only to listen and to wait. The children, if they asked, would be soothed with vague, whispered reassurances, but the fear in your own voice would be hard to disguise. Their small minds would struggle to comprehend the grim message, but their bodies would register the pervasive anxiety of their parents. After what felt like an eternity, the tolls would cease, leaving behind an even deeper, more profound silence. But the memory of the sound, its chilling message, would linger, making any further sleep shallow and restless. The hut would remain shrouded in darkness, but it was a darkness now tinged with a fresh layer of sorrow and apprehension. As dawn eventually broke, casting its pale light into the hut, the first act of the day would be to ascertain the news. Who had died? Whose hut had burned? The community would awaken to a shared burden of grief and renewed vulnerability. The toll of a bell in the dark was more than just a sound. It was a profound communal pronouncement of tragedy. It underscored the immense precarity of medieval peasant life, a stark reminder that in a world without effective medicine, without reliable fire services, without the security of law, sickness, fire, and death were constant, terrifying companions. Each distant chime in the dark was a call to collective fear, a solemn testament to the harsh realities of survival in the medieval night. The fire rekindled. The deepest part of the medieval night was a realm of profound darkness and biting cold, a relentless siege against the fragile warmth of the peasant's hut. The hearth fire, once a cheerful blaze, would have dwindled to almost nothing, a mere memory of embers buried beneath a thick layer of ash. But with the first imperceptible stirrings of pre-dawn, the most vital ritual of endurance would begin anew. The fire rekindled, a fragile victory over the night's relentless chill, a defiant spark against the still prevailing gloom. You would be the one to wake, roused by an inner clock more accurate than any timepiece, or perhaps by the relentless cold that had finally permeated your last layer of blanket. The hut would be in near total darkness, the air thick with the accumulated scents of the night. damp earth, old wood smoke, and the close presence of sleeping bodies. The silence would be profound, broken only by the gentle breathing of your family and the distant whisper of the wind. Crawling from the warmth of the communal straw bed, you would move slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb the others. The floor would be bone-chillingly cold against your bare feet, each step a small, painful awakening. Your muscles, stiff from hours of lying still, would protest, but the urgency of the task was paramount. Kneeling by the hearth, you would feel for the cold, smooth surface of the ashes. Then, with a crude stick or a piece of salvaged metal, you would gently stir, carefully scraping away the grey layer, seeking the precious, persistent heart of the fire. The air would fill with a fine dust of ash, tickling your nostrils, but your eyes would be fixed on the emerging embers, and there it would be. A faint orange glow, a tiny, tenacious spark of life buried deep within the grey. It was a miracle of sorts, a testament to the careful banking of the fire the night before, to the enduring power of friction and fuel. This single spark was everything. With painstaking care, you would begin to build upon this fragile core. First, a few pieces of the driest, finest kindling, painstakingly gathered twigs, tiny splinters of wood. You would arrange them gently over the glowing ember, forming a fragile teepee, leaving just enough space for air. Then you would blow gently at first, then more steadily, with slow, measured breaths. The faint glow would deepen, reddening, then sending a tiny tendril of smoke curling upwards. And then a flicker. A tentative, orange flame, small and vulnerable, would lick at the kindling, growing slowly, hesitantly. The smell of burning wood, sharp and clean, would begin to permeate the smoky air, pushing back the stale scents of the night. As the first small flame caught, you would carefully add larger pieces of wood, dry branches, split logs from the stack by the door. The fire would respond, growing in strength, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness, gradually illuminating the rough walls of the hut, bringing its familiar shapes back into view. The shadows, which had danced ominously through the night, would now retreat, shrinking into corners, vanquished by the growing light. The warmth, at first, just a faint radiation, would begin to spread, pushing back the biting cold. You would hold your hands out to the nascent blaze, feeling the welcome heat on your chilled fingers, soaking it into your bones. It was a profound, visceral comfort, a slow thawing of the night's deep chill. The sound of the fire growing, the gentle crackle, the soft hiss of sap, the subtle roar as it gained strength, was a symphony of renewal, a triumphant chorus against the silence of the deepest night. It was the sound of life, returning, asserting its dominance. Your family would begin to stir, roused by the growing light and warmth. Children would stretch, groaning softly, their small faces still creased with sleep. They would see the fire, and a quiet sense of reassurance would settle over the hut. Another night had passed. The fire had been rekindled. The fire rekindled was more than just a means to cook and keep warm. It was a profound psychological victory. It was the successful navigation of the night's deepest anxieties, the tangible result of vigilance and perseverance. It was the promise of breakfast, of the ability to dry damp clothes, of a brief respite from the relentless cold. As the flames grew stronger, casting their cheerful, dancing light across the hut, a deep, weary sense of accomplishment would fill you. The ashes had been stirred to life again, a fragile victory over the night's chill. It was the first, most crucial act of the new day, a defiant declaration that despite all the hardships, life would find a way to continue, warmed by the enduring heart of the hearth. Restless turns on straw beds. The long, brutal hours of the medieval night were a constant test of endurance. Even when the fire was banked and the family huddled close, sleep was rarely a deep, unbroken repose. It came shallow, elusive, broken by the pervasive cold, by the nagging coughs that echoed through the hut, and by the spectral tendrils of fear that tightened around the heart. The straw bed, your humble sanctuary, bore witness to countless restless turns, each shift a small battle against discomfort and dread. You would lie in the communal straw bed, your body aching from the day's endless toil, wrapped in layers of rough woolen blankets. The warmth of your family, pressed close beside you, offered a tenuous comfort, but the cold was a cunning enemy. It seeped up from the damp earth, found gaps in the blankets, infiltrated your extremities. Your feet, often cold, would feel like blocks of ice, and no amount of tucking or burrowing seemed to fully banish the chill. The straw itself, while insulating, was a constant source of irritation. Its dry stalks poked and scratched, worked their way into your clothes, and harbored fleas whose relentless bites kept sleep at bay. You would shift again and again, trying to find a more comfortable position, trying to ease the persistent itch, trying to escape the hard reality of the floor beneath. The rustle of the straw was a constant, dry whisper, a soundtrack to your restless discomfort. Then there was the cough. Perhaps your own, a persistent rasp in your chest, aggravated by the smoky air and the damp cold, or the more distressing sound of a child's fitful cough, their small body racked by the effort, bringing a fresh wave of fear and worry. Your hand would instinctively reach out in the darkness, touching their forehead, checking for fever, pulling them closer, though you knew there was little effective remedy to offer beyond warmth and whispered reassurances. Each cough, each wheeze, was a painful reminder of the fragile hold on health. Fear, too, was a constant companion in the darkness. The memory of the day's dangers, the apprehension of the morrow, the unsettling sounds from beyond the shuttered door, the distant howl of a wolf, the sudden bark of a dog, the creak of the wind in the rafters, these would chase sleep away. Your mind, freed from the demands of waking labor, would replay anxieties, conjuring images of hunger, sickness, and violence. You would turn again, a restless shift in the straw, trying to find a position that offered both warmth and a fleeting sense of ease. The heavy woolen blankets, though scratchy, were pulled tighter, tucked more securely. Your face would be buried in the rough fabric, trying to block out the sounds, trying to force your mind into a deeper slumber. But sleep remained shallow, a light veil rather than a heavy blanket. It was a state of heightened awareness, a subconscious vigilance that never fully relinquished its hold. You would drift in and out, experiencing fragmented dreams, disturbed by the cold, by a sudden sound, by the persistent gnawing of hunger in your stomach. The hut would remain in profound darkness for hours, broken only by the faint, dying glow of embers or the occasional brief flash of light from a shift in the fire. The air felt heavy, stagnant, cold. Time, unbound by sunlight or task, stretched out, immense and slow, each restless turn marking its agonizing passage. For the children, sleep might be deeper, protected by the warmth of their parents and the innocence of youth. But even they would stir, sometimes whimpering from cold or a nightmare, their small bodies instinctively seeking the warmth of another. The stars above the hut. The medieval night, particularly from within the cramped, smoky confines of a peasant's hut, was often a realm of utter darkness. The shuttered windows and thick mud walls sealed out the world, but sometimes through the imperfections of even the most carefully constructed shelter, a tiny portal opened. A gap in the thatch, a crack between rough-hewn timbers, could offer a fleeting glimpse of the vast, uncaring sky above, a silent, glittering panorama of stars that served as both a distant wonder and a profound, humbling reminder of human insignificance. You would lie on your straw bed, perhaps unable to sleep, your mind wrestling with the cold, the hunger, or the anxieties that populated the darkness. Your gaze, accustomed to the profound gloom, would drift upwards, tracing the rough, smoke-stained timbers of the roof. And there, against the absolute blackness of the night, a tiny, almost impossibly bright pinprick of light would appear. It was a star, not the soft, hazy glow of distant starlight, but a piercing, sharp point of light, unwavering and cold, glimpsed through a small, fortuitous gap in the thick thatch. This tiny window to the cosmos was utterly unexpected, a brief, startling interruption to the enclosed, intimate world of the hut. The sight was breathtaking in its suddenness, its immense scale. It was a reminder of a universe far, far beyond the confines of your village, beyond the reach of warlords, harvests, or illness. The stars, countless and indifferent, shone with an ancient light, oblivious to the struggles of humanity below. They were beautiful, yes, but also profoundly alien, vast and uncaring. Through the same crack, you might also glimpse a sliver of the moon if it was high in the sky. A pale, ghostly crescent, or a full, luminous orb, casting its ethereal light over the silent fields and the broken ruins beyond the village. Its presence, though cold, offered a faint, otherworldly illumination, transforming the world outside into a landscape of stark contrasts and long, shifting shadows. The tiny window to the stars served as a profound contrast to the immediate, pressing realities of your life. Inside the hut, life was a constant, intimate struggle against physical discomfort and gnawing fears. Outside, the universe unfolded with a majestic, timeless indifference, its grandeur utterly untouched by human suffering or human triumph. For a moment, as you gazed at that distant, cold light, your own small worries might seem to shrink, rendered insignificant against the backdrop of such vastness. The cold felt colder, the hunger more profound, the darkness more absolute, because the star offered a glimpse of a scale so immense that it made your entire existence feel microscopic. Yet, there was also a subtle, almost unacknowledged comfort in the constancy of the stars. They had been there for millennia, observing the rise and fall of civilizations, the passage of countless human lives. Their unwavering presence was a symbol of an enduring order, however distant and impersonal, in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. The cold light of the stars was also a navigational tool, a way for the rare traveler to find their way, for the farmer to understand the turning of the seasons. But for you, lying awake in the deepest part of the night, it was primarily a source of quiet contemplation, a silent dialogue with the immensity of existence. You would watch the tiny, unblinking eye of light until your eyelids grew heavy, or until the first subtle shift of dawn began to soften the absolute blackness of the crack. The star would fade, not because it had vanished, but because the encroaching light of the new day rendered it invisible. The stars above the hut were a profound, humbling spectacle glimpsed through cracks in the roof, reminding peasants of a vast, uncaring sky. They were a reminder of humanity's place in the cosmos, small, fragile, and utterly dependent on the immediate earth for survival. And as the tiny, cold light vanished with the approach of dawn, it left behind a quiet, enduring sense of awe, a lingering echo of the immense, indifferent beauty that lay beyond the thin, sheltering layers of your humble, enduring home. The cocks crow. The deepest hours of the medieval night were a profound test of human endurance, a realm of cold, fear, and an almost suffocating darkness. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, punctuated by discomfort and anxiety. But even in the bleakest depths there was an unspoken promise, an ancient harbinger of relief that would eventually cut through the oppressive silence. The cock's crow. It was a raw, insistent declaration, a sound of profound reassurance that dawn approached, and with it the blessed return of light and safety. You would lie in the darkness, having endured hours of the night's relentless chill, perhaps listening to the last, fading whispers of the wind, or the distant, unsettling sounds of the wild. Your body would be stiff, your mind weary, yearning for the end of the long vigil. The hut would be in near total darkness, the embers long since vanished, the cold settling deep into your bones. Then, piercing the profound stillness, it would come. A sudden, ragged crow, sharp and defiant, rising from the small, hidden world of the chicken coop within your hut, or from a neighbor's byre. It was not a melodic sound, but a powerful, guttural declaration, raw and unpolished, yet filled with an undeniable authority. Your body would tense, then immediately relax, a profound, shuddering sigh of relief escaping your lips. The cock's crow, the ancient, reliable signal. Dawn approached. The terrifying, vulnerable hours of the deep night were finally, mercifully, beginning to recede. The sound was more than just a call. It was a physical manifestation of hope. It pushed back against the darkness, against the lingering fears, against the pervasive cold. It was the sound of life asserting itself, a tenacious, persistent affirmation that the cycle would turn, that the sun would rise, that the world would not remain forever trapped in the grip of night. Other roosters, emboldened by the first, would soon join in, their calls echoing across the scattered village, a ragged chorus of defiant hope. The sound would stir your sleeping family. Children would whimper, then stretch, their small bodies beginning to stir with the instinctive knowledge that the world was about to change. Your husband would groan, a sound of weary awakening, his hand reaching for yours, perhaps in an unspoken acknowledgement of the night endured. The darkness of the hut, though still absolute, would suddenly feel less oppressive. The cold, though still biting, would feel less relentless. The sounds of the outside world, once terrifying, would now be awaited with a sense of hopeful anticipation. You could almost feel the first faint bruise of light at the edge of the horizon, slowly, inexorably pushing back the black. The cock's crow was a profound psychological anchor. It marked the passage from vulnerability to a renewed, if fragile, sense of security. It was a reminder that despite all the hardships, despite the constant battle against hunger, cold, and illness, the rhythms of the natural world, ancient and unyielding, continued. You would begin the slow, deliberate process of rising, your muscles protesting, your mind still clouded with the remnants of sleep. But your movements would be imbued with a renewed purpose, a sense of urgency. The day, with its endless toil, was about to begin, but with it came the blessed return of light, of visibility, of the ability to face dangers in the open rather than in the terrifying unknown. The first task would be the fire, now easier to rekindle with the promise of light. The water would be fetched, the bread prepared. The hut, which had felt like a fortress under siege, would begin its slow transformation back into a living, working space. The cock's crow was not just a sound of relief, it was the voice of endurance, a testament to the resilient spirit of ordinary people surviving against immense odds. Dawn approached, and with it, light and safety, fragile, temporary, but profoundly vital. And as the rooster crowed again, his voice echoing across the awakening village, you understood that another brutal night had been endured, and another day of struggle and perhaps survival had begun. Surviving another night. The cock's crow, ragged and defiant, had long since faded into the brightening air. The deep, pervasive darkness of the medieval night, which had pressed so heavily against the hut's fragile walls, was finally giving way to the pale, bruised light of dawn. The world outside, revealed in stark, familiar detail, was still cold, still challenging, but it was no longer the realm of unseen terrors. You had survived another night. You moved with the familiar, weary rhythm of the newly awakened peasant. The fire, coaxed back to life, now offered a tentative warmth, its smoke curling lazily towards the smoke hole in the roof. The coarse bread and thin pottage, the same sustenance as yesterday, were being prepared. The animals in their byre stirred, their lowing and clucking a familiar backdrop to the morning's quiet industry. Your body, stiff and aching from the cold and the restless turns on the straw bed, slowly began to respond to the demands of the day. Your hands, calloused and rough, reached for tools, for water, for the children's eager, demanding hands. There was no exhilaration in this survival, no joyous celebration, only a deep-seated, quiet resignation, a profound acceptance of the relentless cycle. As the sun, a pale, weak disk, finally edged above the distant tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the frozen fields, a subtle transformation occurred. The external world, which had been so menacing in the darkness, now became navigable. The winding paths, the silent ruins, the edge of the forest. These were no longer amorphous threats, but tangible landscapes demanding your labor. The shuttered door, which had been a symbol of defense against the night, was now unbarred, pushed open to allow the precious daylight in. The bitter wind still whispered, carrying the sharp scent of frost and damp earth, but its chill felt less insidious in the light. The long, cold hours of darkness, with their fears of wolves, bandits, and sickness, had passed. Your children, once huddled in the deepest sleep, were now awake, their small faces animated by the promise of the day, their small hands reaching for the meager breakfast. Their resilience was a constant source of wonder, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to adapt and endure. You would step out of the hut perhaps to fetch water from the well, or to tend to the animals. The morning air would bite at your exposed skin, but the sun's hesitant light on your face was a small, vital comfort. You would survey the village, noting the other plumes of smoke rising from neighbors' huts, a collective affirmation that they too had endured. The occasional call of another peasant, or the distant barking of a dog, would serve as a reminder of the enduring community, a fragile network of shared survival. The tasks of the day, familiar and unyielding, would quickly take hold. The ploughing, the sowing, the foraging for firewood, the mending of clothes, the endless, repetitive cycle of work would begin anew. There was no time for reflection, no space for lingering over the fears of the past night or the uncertainties of the future. Survival demanded constant, immediate action. Yet beneath the surface of this relentless toil, an unspoken understanding persisted. Another night had been survived. Another victory, however small, had been secured against the overwhelming forces that sought to extinguish life. The cold floors, the flickering flames, the fragile shields against darkness. These were the intimate realities of your existence, the defining parameters of your world. As the sun climbed higher, casting its weak, pale light over the village, illuminating the rough textures of the mud-daubed walls and the worn surfaces of your tools, you knew with a profound certainty what lay ahead. The day would be long, filled with its own hardships. And as the sun would inevitably dip behind the fields once more, the darkness would return, the cold would creep in, and another brutal night would already be waiting. But for now, there was light. For now, there was warmth. For now, there was the promise of food, however meager. And in that quiet, enduring present, there was a profound testament to the relentless, stubborn, and ultimately triumphant will of the medieval peasant to survive, not just the day, but the terrifying, endless cycle of night and darkness.